You're listening to the Exceptional Girls Podcast, and I'm your host, Julie Withrow. As a mom who raised a twice exceptional young daughter, I know both the joys and the challenges of parenting a child who thinks, learns, and experiences the world differently. I also know how lonely it can feel and how long it can take to get answers. I created this podcast to increase awareness, understanding, and acceptance of female neurodivergence. In doing so, I hope to smooth the path for other families. Please join me for expert interviews and candid conversations about giftedness, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and more. Let's learn together how we can make sure our exceptional girls feel seen, supported, and celebrated. In this episode of the Exceptional Girls Podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Theresa Lyons. Dr. Lyons is the founder and CEO of Navigating AWEtism, a platform that translates autism research into clear, actionable guidance for families. With a PhD from Yale and a perspective shaped by her own parenting journey, she's helped families in more than 21 countries better understand and support their autistic children. And in today's episode, you'll also benefit from her research-grounded insights and practical guidance for raising autistic daughters. Dr. Lyons explains why autism in girls is so often missed, how chronic masking can impact mental health, and why many parents struggle to get clear answers and support. We also talk openly about autistic meltdowns and the emotional strain families carry, often secretly. My hope is that you'll walk away from this episode feeling informed, supported, and more confident in how you're showing up for your child while also taking care of yourself along the way. Hi, Dr. Lyons. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so today we're going to do kind of a deep dive on autism. And as we get started, I was thinking about my own experience as a mom, raising an autistic child. And I was thinking back to when we first learned that Remy was autistic. And maybe unlike other people, for us, our autism identification, I like to use that word versus diagnosis. I don't like to pathologize things so much. But when we first learned that Remy was autistic, for us, we were more confirming a hunch. Remy had, several other things, that we knew about by that point, like giftedness and ADHD and different things. For many parents, autism could be the first big thing that they're learning about their child. And it can be kind of a shock or a surprise. It can be sort of a scary thing to learn about your kid, especially if you don't know much about autism. There's a lot of misperceptions about autism out there. And so I think it's only natural that you're going to have a lot of questions, right? And you're going to be seeking some answers. And, a lot of parents, I think, look to professionals like pediatricians or therapists, or maybe even people at school to try to get answers. And unfortunately, what they find is that these professionals don't have a lot of training or expertise in autism. So they're kind of hard pressed to find those answers they're looking for. And I know that your work kind of centers on bridging that gap, right? You translate the scientific research on autism into, real answers and guidance that families can use. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, what do families need right now, like from these professionals who are supporting them? What are you seeing and what are you hearing?
So the most important thing for a parent to understand is to start to think about who has the information that I need. And that's really the mindset that as a parent you want to be in, because a pediatrician is not allowed to make an autism diagnosis. So if they're not allowed to make an autism diagnosis, they're not really going to stay up to date on the current literature. They're not going to know all the ins and outs. So parents, they trust their pediatrician, and that's why they ask them these important questions. But those pediatricians don't have the training for the most part. So really starting to get selective about who you take information from is important, and how you go about finding those people are, okay, what kind of training are they taking? And how up to date are they? How relevant is the information they're giving me? Is it 20 years old? Is it 30 years old? Are they out there learning something new every day? So it becomes really important to get very selective about who the parent asks for information. And the way you do that is you start to understand that person's training. And then the next step would be to start thinking about, does my child need what they are an expert in? And so that's like that next step.
Yeah. Do you have can you provide some practical advice for how they start to figure out like what these people's backgrounds are and things like that? I mean, I imagine a lot of times they start to ask maybe friends or seek in parent groups or things like that, right? But so aside from those, are there some other ways where they might be able to get a better sense of who the right people are to talk to?
Yeah. So in the beginning, and I know I went through this as well, right? So you get this kind of panic mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of emotions that come with an autism diagnosis. And once you have the diagnosis, a lot of times there's a grieving process for a variety of things. You might experience anger, all of these negative emotions, right? And then a lot of times we as parents, we get guilt. Like, okay, now we should be doing something. We have all these emotions, but what are we doing about it? What are we doing about it? And when we're in that emotional state of either grieving or, being upset, we just kind of start grabbing at things and we start matching the overwhelm that we feel with what we do. And so really that first step for a parent who's just like, all right, let me just start asking anybody, is to just take a moment with themselves. And when I say a moment, it might be a day, it might be a week, could be even a little bit longer, depending upon their own state, and say, all right, let me make sure I am going to make these decisions from a grounded place. What do I need to do so that I'm not making mistakes and doing the wrong thing and not even knowing that I'm doing the wrong thing, right? A lot of times parents then reflect years later and they're like, I don't even know why I was doing that. Usually it's because you were just so desperate to try something to make it feel like you're doing something to kind of alleviate that almost anxiety we have in us as to like, we want to be a good parent, we need to be doing something. So really that first step is to just take a breath, however long that takes, and then from there you can start asking for references, recommendations from people locally in your community if you feel like that's the approach that you want. Some parents say, you know what, I really want to focus more on healthcare, and so they're willing to drive a couple of hours maybe to see a doctor once a year or something like that. So it really depends on what is that next step that the parent wants, and what determines that is the child, right? So if the child is having different health issues, then yes, it makes sense to really get involved in getting a good healthcare team. If it's more struggling in school, maybe focus, health definitely plays a role in that, but it might be more how do I study with the way I learn? How, and teaching the person how they learn themselves so they're not so critical on themselves. So it really depends on what the child needs. And it's important to focus on that, and that's unique for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I also want to go back to something you said because this is kind of sticking with me and something I didn't even know. And that is that pediatricians can't diagnose autism. I don't
Nope.
think I knew that. Yeah. Can you talk about that just for a minute?
For for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
is going to be given by a developmental pediatrician or a pediatric neurologist,
Mm-hmm.
someone who has this extra special training in childhood development and neurology. And
Mm-hmm.
so the diagnosis right now for autism is made on observation. So
Mm-hmm.
there's no blood test, there's no urine test, there's no MRI. We could talk a little bit later about some cutting edge research about MRIs and stuff, but you cannot use an MRI to make a diagnosis at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So what you want to get in front of is someone who is making diagnoses or not every day and really involved in autism. So the general pediatrician, when you have all these well checks and things like that, they're looking for red flags. And if they see some, they might talk to you about it. And they might say, you know what, I think it's important that you see a specialist. And that's really the role of the pediatrician. And then even after parents get a diagnosis, and sometimes they're going to their pediatrician and might be asking just even some simple health questions that might be related to autism, that's not the expert. The pediatrician is really that generalist. And we always have to remember that as parents. We can ask them for their insight, but we got to remember, are they dealing with this all day, like in and out? Are they living and breathing this? And if not, then it's not the right person to ask.
Yeah, I think that's a really important reminder. I think that another important reminder is, particularly for parents of autistic girls, is that autism has historically been studied through a male lens. And this is
Correct.
one of the main reasons why I started this podcast in the first place, is because a lot of times we don't understand how these neurodivergent differences like autism actually can present differently in girls, because the research has really centered, on the male presentation in the vast majority of cases. So how does this impact a girl's ability to be accurately identified?
So the diagnosis, so autism is a spectrum, and there's a profound autism in which what it looks like is a person might not be speaking at all. They might not have any way of doing communication. They might have difficulty getting dressed and eating, cutting food on their own. They might not ever be able to drive. So that's one side of the spectrum. And then on the other side is someone who is, they term it more high functioning. Many people don't like that phrase, but what it looks like is they can dress themselves, they can go to school, cross the street on their own, have a lot more freedom in daily living. And the difficulty in diagnosing autism for girls tends to be on the more high functioning side. So profound autism is profound, right?
Right.
And so that the differences there don't change that much, but it's really in these nuances. And again, because the autism diagnosis is made on observation, this is why you would want someone who has really good expertise in being able to distinguish between ADHD and autism, right? For those two diagnoses.
Right.
In autism, 40%, there was a meta-analysis done on this that studied hundreds of thousands of kids with autism and ADHD. And about 40% of those with autism also have ADHD. And so there is also this ebb and the flow of, okay, is it ADHD? Is it autism? And again, that's where you need someone with high level expertise who could explain, okay, what is what, so that then you can have the appropriate focus. So girls tend to mask more. Yes, there's research that shows that. And masking just means more like imitation. And women in general, we kind of do that. We look at society. We have different, and we could think of it as, I know for myself, I have different friend groups. When I'm with this group, they're a little bit more rowdy. When I'm with this group, they're more like this. And I kind of, ebb and flow into what it is. And if I don't, right, then you kind of stick out a little bit. And we all know that social experience of when you don't quite yet fit in. So we all have experience of masking. We do that usually with jobs, right? Especially when we're working in person, right? You're in the car, you're playing music, you're having fun, and then you're like, okay, I got to go to work. Serious face, right? So there is an essence of masking to go throughout the world, but it becomes problematic when, and girls do this a lot, they internalize a lot of the stress and it becomes internal. And that is when it gets a bit more difficult to actually make an autism diagnosis, because they might prohibit themselves from doing stimming, right? So
Mm-hmm.
repetitive behaviors are something that is telltale for an autism diagnosis, right? But if they're stimming or flapping their hands and they've been made fun of, then they'll modify that behavior just so that they can fit in, even though it's hard for them to stop it. And a lot of times, then this is what happens when girls come home from school, right? So they've done a lot of masking. It takes a lot of energy, right, to pretend that you are not going to do something when you really want to do something. And a lot of times, then parents deal with some explosiveness behavior at home just because that's the child who finally feels safe and just releases all of that stress. So there's a lot that goes to masking. Um, and really understanding the extent of masking and when it happens, and then how do you address that with your child?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about this because I think that, masking is one of those things that's really misunderstood because to your point, we all do it, to
Right.
some extent, just to be socially acceptable, right? Or to fit into different social situations. But, it's this sort of chronic masking that's really what we're talking about here. And I think speaking to the observational aspects of identifying, things like autism and ADHD, this is where the parent side of it comes in too, right? Whenever if you've ever completed those questionnaires, there's a big parent portion of this. And I remember really understanding that piece, like, when my kid would come home and really have that explosive kind of meltdown situation,
Right.
and also understanding, like, particularly as Remy got older, they learned how to not stim in public, but when they got home, then they would, right? But they'd kind of bottled it up all day long. But I do think, yeah, like this masking thing is tricky. And I think, as a professional, how do you even suss that out? Like, are there techniques that you can use to kind of determine, like, that a girl is masking and therefore maybe she's actually autistic? How do you like figure that out?
Well, understanding autism meltdowns are important, right? So you were saying about how uh, when your child would come home, then it's like there's this release, but then there's also that meltdown. And so
Hmm.
what an autism meltdown is when the nervous system is just completely overwhelmed. And we see that with kids all across the spectrum, many times when they're younger. Out in public, in schools, right? So what happens is there's just an overwhelmment. It might be too much light. A lot of times schools with the fluorescent lighting, or if you go into any department store, the fluorescent lighting. So there are certain triggers that then starts to overwhelm the nervous system. And if the nervous system is not starting at, a low and calm level, small things like this can just add up. And this is also where parents are kind of like, wait, how did this happen? Okay, most people can walk into, the department store and not have it be overwhelming. But this is where that additive on our nervous system happens. And an autism meltdown cannot necessarily just be stopped, right? Like a tantrum, right? The tantrum is usually being thrown because the child wants something, right? They want the iPad and there's, I want it, and no, I want it, fine, you can have it. And all of a sudden they stop. It's they can just get up, they're playing the tablet, all no problems, right? So that is your classic tantrum. A meltdown is you can't stop it. So sometimes kids get very aggressive, right? They just want to be left alone and they need to unwind themselves. And what happens is you have that explosiveness at first. And it's very scary for them because their body is entirely out of control, right? You've hit the red zone. And parents get very stressed because how do they help them? Any parent is like, okay, I just want to stop it. But the thing is, the more you try and stop it, right, the more pressure you're putting on that nervous system. So it becomes this kind of catch 22. And with autism meltdowns, usually the best thing to do is make sure the person is safe. Give them a quiet room. You can stay nearby. Um, Over experience, you can figure out, okay, does my child need me within 1 foot, or can I be about 4 feet away? Like, where is their comfort zone so they know that I'm there to help them, but I'm not putting any additional pressure. So autism meltdowns is something that parents and doctors ask about to understand that masking of it, right? So if autism meltdowns have remained the same or they've started increasing, then okay, there's a problem here. And that's also when you can start to go in and look at health aspects, right? So what is causing the nervous system to be revved up so high? So these are all questions that can start to be asked, but understanding autism meltdowns is really important.
Yeah. Speaking of the health aspects, I think this is another thing about autism that people can be kind of surprised to learn, and that's that it can be accompanied by, very real like physical and medical challenges, right? I know sometimes there's like eating components to it and various things. And so without an understanding of this, like a child's issues can easily be sort of dismissed or misunderstood by doctors and medical
Yep. By
professionals,
untrained doctors.
by untrained
That's the key
doctors.
thing.
That's right. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what are some of the typical health issues that you see, in autistic girls, and how does this improve like their quality of life? Or maybe more importantly, how does like addressing them improve their quality of life?
So first is sleep. That's
Hmm.
really the place to start because if
Yeah.
you're not getting a good night's sleep, then your nervous system, we all know it, autism or not, if you don't get a good night's sleep, your nervous system, everything the next day is just much more difficult.
Hmm.
And if you compound that by not getting quality sleep, every night or maybe 5 nights a week, you don't sleep well. This is when you start going in that negative direction because then so much associated with our health is dependent upon sleep. So sleep is certainly really important. A lot of times that happens when vitamin D status is not optimal. So these are again like a simple blood test that can be done. Your pediatrician can
Hmm.
order simple tests like that, right? That is actually something a pediatrician, a good pediatrician, would be doing at least once a year. They would do blood work, and we know blood work is not the most favorite for children to do, right? But certain information is really important to get with sleep issues, right? So focusing more on girls and girls who are verbal and are speaking. A lot of times the sleep issues are coming from anxiety,
Yeah.
right? And so then this is internalized. So this is where you can start to really unwrap what is going on, starting with sleep and health wise. So you look at the sleep, you start to understand, okay, what is causing this lack of sleep? So you can look at different basic health stuff, vitamin D, there's a lot different nutrients, magnesium, right? So there's a lot of basic stuff that can be done. But then if your child is saying, you know what, I'm worried about tomorrow, I'm worried about school, and you talk them through that, and sometimes we have stressful days and we just need to talk and let it out, and all right, then we go to sleep. But if this anxiety is pervasive, then what you'll notice is a pattern of them always being worried. So they might get over that worry, maybe it was a test and they did well on that test, and then they come home, another trouble night sleeping. Okay, what's the problem now? I'm worried about my friend Sally, right? So the situation has just changed, but the anxiety, the worry, the constant loop is the same. So that's when you go in and say, okay, this is definitely a health issue, we need to address it. So this could be a gut infection, it could be they call it leaky gut, right? So we can start to look at the immune system. Is there any autoimmunity that is preventing just problems with the body unwinding? So there's definitely a lot of health aspects that can be explored. And the important thing is, if anyone tells you any of your medical concerns about your child is just autism, right? Oh, that's just autism. Oh, kids with autism, yeah, they're anxious. That's just autism. Oh, they don't sleep. Yeah, that's no, that is not the doctor to be working with, because each of these health issues can be resolved. And the frustrating thing is, if your child didn't have that autism diagnosis and you went to that same doctor, they would treat your child very differently. So it's really important to work with people who are respectful and who fully understand the health implications that are involved in autism.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, what you're touching on here, which doesn't just happen when you go to the doctor, it happens when you go to school and all those things, is the importance of
Yes.
having to advocate, for
Oh,
for
yeah.
your kid, right? I mean, I think it's just part and parcel of being the parent of not just a kid with autism, any neurodivergent kid. Like you have to learn how to advocate. You have to sort of listen to your gut and do your
Oh,
own research,
Yeah.
and ask for what you think your kid needs or what your kid needs. And I think it's just kind of what you have to do, right?
Yeah. It doesn't, like, for me, it didn't come natural. I
Yeah.
have to say, it did not. I remember the first IEP meeting. I was so nervous. I went in a suit because I was like, okay, like I had stopped working for a while, but I'm like, this is an important meeting. All right, I got to put my heels on, nylon, suit. Like, this is serious. And I still walked out there not even knowing if I did a good job. And
Yeah.
that's the thing where it's like, did I get what she needs? Did I do good? Did I do bad? It's just, it's really hard to even know how well you're doing because
Yeah.
it's all just, yeah.
It is. I will say though, I was just having this conversation with my husband last night because we were talking about Remy, who's now in their second year of college, and how Remy has become such a strong self advocate. And I do feel like, I don't pat myself on the back very often as a parent, but man, I think Remy watched me do that for them. And I kind of taught
Right.
Remy how to do that, for themselves, particularly starting in middle school, where parents weren't so welcome, at school anymore. And then in the high school. And I really encouraged Remy how to advocate for themselves and how to do that in a way that was productive. Now that Remy's in college, they're really good at it. Like my
Yeah.
husband and I were both kind of like, wow, Remy's gotten really good at asking for what they need and asking for what they want. So the good news
Awesome.
is, there can be a payoff down the road, but yeah, when you're first doing it, it can be really hard. And like you said, even you, who some people may feel like, well, gosh, I mean, you're a doctor and, you should feel comfortable with all this. But even for you, right, it can feel
No.
yeah, it can feel very uncomfortable. But
It feels very uncomfortable because then it's like you're, this is my child, the stakes are
mhm,
much higher, like it just, I want to do a good job, right? I became a parent and I took that as a responsibility, so it's like, oh, I want to do a good job. And many times parents think advocating is being that loud voice and
mhm,
yelling. And I have to say, over the years, many times I was like, ah, I wish I could just go in and yell
mhm,
and have it all just work. But I know that will be the worst thing to do. But I don't know, like on TV, you see people all of a sudden just get like mad and then everything slows,
mhm,
right? And it's like, that's not real life. This advocating, like you touched on, is this partnership dance. And it's like you have somebody on the other side who probably disagrees with what you say, or doesn't want to give you a certain thing or something like that. And advocating really is, how can we dance together and create something where we both thought we couldn't do anything. So it is this gentleness, and you can apply that skill to anyone. So like, Remy, I'm sure as they mature into their career, that's going to be a huge benefit to any team that she's on, right?
mhm.
She's going to have a very different perspective, from what many other kids will have.
Yeah, I know. We were talking about that. Like, it's just a really important life skill. And yeah, I mean, it's really a negotiation. It's kind of how I used to
It
go in and
is.
I was kind of a bulldog, right? Because that's what I thought I had to be. Like, I was gonna like make my points and we were gonna win, right? It was like I was going in
Yes.
like
Oh,
like we had to win. That was my
yeah.
mentality. But then I realized it was very much a negotiation, and particularly at school, because I also started to have a lot of educator friends, just kind of, through some of my own research and some of the work that I was doing, because I'm a researcher, right? And I wanted to learn all about this stuff. And I really learned that, a lot of educators they didn't have the bandwidth to give my kid all
Oh,
this
yes.
attention or to really put everybody's 504, plan in place perfectly, or their IEPs, because they didn't have the resources themselves. And then that
Right.
really shifted my thinking. Like, okay, even if they wanted to do everything, that I'm asking, they may not even be able to. It's not a
Right.
matter of them wanting to, right? It's just a matter of sometimes they just can't. So we're going to have to come to some sort of agreement here that's workable for both of us. And then when I shifted, like that made a big difference. But
Yeah.
speaking of advocacy, I mean, sometimes it's a lot. You feel like there's
It's
so
a
many
lot.
things that you're trying to put in place to make sure your kid's getting the support and the resources and things that they need to be successful. So when it comes to like being an informed advocate, like where should parents like really put their energy? Like where should they focus when it feels like there's so much to think about?
Yeah, so it depends on really what the child needs. So sometimes, especially when kids are younger, this is when a parent might choose to homeschool for a year or so to kind of take that pressure off of school, especially if sleep is a problem. I see a lot
Yeah.
of people do that when sleep is a problem. They're like, all right, we got to homeschool. Let's work on sleep. Let's work on health. This is when you can make diet changes much easier, right? So there's a lot that can be addressed health wise, get the child in a much better place so that they're open and interested more in learning. So it really depends on what the child needs and makes the most sense. And that's the part that I think is scary to many parents because, at least in my mind, it was like, all right, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, like you just go marching along. And really nowadays, and when you have a child who has different needs, it's not that linear straight line whatsoever anyway. And AI is changing everything. So we used to have this linear march to college and then to, a career and stuff. And AI is changing so much of that. So I think it's really important for parents to really just focus on what does my child need at this time. Let's not worry about, how they're going to do in high school and things like that. It's really what is it that they need, and then go from there. And the other thing to think about school, right? We talked about doctors and how certain doctors stay up to date on certain things, and others it's not really their responsibility, or they're not really incentivized anyway to stay up to date. The same thing happens at school. So when we start talking about how children learn differently, we start talking about what makes the most sense for that particular child. Sometimes you're going to have to actually educate the educator.
Yeah.
And that gets tricky too, because like you're talking about bandwidths, right? So these are people who usually want to do great things for your child, but they don't have the ability to go out and do the research on their own. And then even when you educate them, it's hard to make changes and do things differently. So a lot of times the advocating, it does feel like it's everywhere. And if the parent is starting to get overwhelmed, then just trim it back a little bit. And I like to have a parent focus on what are the top 3 things that are most meaningful right now. And that really helps give clarity as to, okay, should we focus on education? Should we focus on the gut? Do we need a different doctor? Like all of these different things. And one of those options is, do I need a little bit of a break myself? Right? Because as a parent, if you're getting kind of like snippy and short and irritated and grouchy or things like that, you're just not going to see the results that you want. So sometimes the most important thing to do is to take a little breather for yourself. And it's really important for parents to understand that and say it's okay to not be doing 20 different things for your child every day, all day, because you realistically might only need to be doing 3. But you wouldn't be able to see that if you don't take that time to pause for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important that you said that. I mean, the first thing I want to say, again, because I'm farther along on this journey, right, is that, having the benefit of hindsight is that, just remember that this too shall pass. Like when you're in it, it's hard to have that perspective. The one thing I can say, about having raised a kid who is twice exceptional and definitely autistic, that's the identification that, that really fit, is that Remy developed like kind of in fits and starts. Like we'd feel like really stuck, and then Remy would have like some big breakthrough, right? And so just about the time it would feel like, wow, are we ever going to get through this? Remy would have like this big developmental thing happen that, we pushed right through. And I think that happens a lot with any kid, but sometimes it's real spiky, with kids like this. So just remember, like you're going to get through it, right? It's going to feel really hard right now, but you will get through it. So don't put so much pressure on yourself to have to like white knuckle it and figure it out right now, right?
Right.
But really important what you said is, parents taking care of themselves. And when you're raising an autistic child, it can take all of your time and attention and focus. Right? It can be really, yeah, it can
Definitely.
be really, I mean, it can be,
Not it can, I think it does.
yeah.
Like it just it takes every ounce of your
It
being.
does. And we also talked about, before we sat down today, how it can even be considered a traumatic experience. Like it's not just physically and emotionally draining. There can actually be a trauma component to this. And
Yeah, the research for that, let me
yeah,
just, it's, that's not like you and I
right. I
just,
want you to share more about that, right? Because I think it's really important that we talk about how parents and caregivers really need to take care of themselves in this.
yeah. So the research is just starting to show that parents who have a child with autism and emotional dysregulation, they have an increased risk of 20 to 30% of getting a PTSD diagnosis from the experience of raising that child with autism. And I don't say that in any way to say anything negative about a child with autism, but all of these aspects that we're navigating as parents are traumatic. Autism meltdowns are traumatic. They're traumatic for the child, but they really are traumatic for the parents as well. And especially to be living maybe in years of, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. This is all trauma that we experience as parents, and it builds up. So there are some parents who do get an official PTSD diagnosis, and there's some research that's coming out. There was a small clinical trial that was done last year on parents. It was 7 parents. It was 5 moms and 2 dads. So it's important to understand trauma is experienced by both the parents. And they did about 5 to 7 EMDR sessions. So it's the eye movement desensitization. That's one of the gold standard treatments for PTSD. And within these 5 to 7 treatments, those parents actually lost their PTSD diagnosis. And what was measured also was that their child, who did not do any intervention whatsoever, their child was responding to the parents' nervous system being a lot more settled, and they could actually measure changes, beneficial changes in the children of these parents who did the therapy. So I also don't say that to make a parent feel guilty, like, oh, my kids are all wound up because I'm wound up. There is some truth to it, but I don't want you to put more pressure on yourself, because that's not gonna help with the unwinding. But it's important that when you feel this level of stress, that you address it and you don't let it add up, because it can really turn into a PTSD diagnosis. And I'm sure your child does not want it.
I think you're also touching on, a part of raising an autistic child that doesn't get talked about very often, and that is sometimes when autistic kids are having a meltdown and it's explosive, they can actually get kind of violent, right? And they can direct that
Oh,
towards the
yes, yes, yes,
parent.
yes.
And that is, in fact, a traumatic experience that a lot of parents who experience it, I think, are embarrassed to talk about, right? And they're ashamed to talk about it. But that is, I mean, not all parents experience that, and not all autistic, kids have that violent meltdown, but some do, right? And that is a very
Yeah,
real
many
thing.
many
Hmm.
do. Many do. So there's, and that's what we were talking about in the beginning of, when a child has an autism meltdown. What is the space that you can give your child so that they feel safe, but that they themselves are safe and the parent is
Right.
safe? So and that can change, right? So your child might be, banging their head against the wall. You might go to try and move them, rightfully so, and then they might maybe grab your hair, or maybe they bite you, or maybe they kick you, right? Because they're in that moment, they're not your child. They're a human that is just having this overwhelming sensory experience. So they're in extreme fight or flight. So when someone is in that state, it's hard, but you have to separate and be like, that is not my loving child. This is someone who does not mean to hit me or bite me or anything along those lines. And that is where the trauma comes from, because you have a child that you love who has this autism meltdown, who then might be abusive towards you, right? And so the parent has to figure out, how do I keep my child safe without myself getting hurt? Right. And most parents are not thinking about this,
Right.
right? This is the added stress of having a child with autism. And it's reality. So when a parent is feeling like overwhelmed, I can't sleep myself because now I'm worrying about different things, it's important to seek whatever would be beneficial for them. Sometimes it's, okay, let me just start meditating. Let me start taking a walk. Let me start doing some exercise so I can, engage my body and de-stress myself. Sometimes it is, let me go get a diagnosis for PTSD and then let me really address that. So it is important for parents to understand that it's not them being a bad parent because their child maybe bit them or hit them or kicked them or something along those lines because of that autism meltdown. What you want to do is understand, why did that autism meltdown happen? And then especially any health issues, like there are some kids who have seizures that are not diagnosed that can trigger some of these autism meltdowns. So there's a lot of health aspect related. So it's really important to address those.
Yeah, yeah, I'm really glad we talked about that because I know that for, I see in parent groups and I even have friends, and this aspect of it is something that everybody kind of has the shame around. Nobody wants to talk about it openly, and I understand. But from parents who've experienced it and understand it, I really think we sort of have to bring it out of the shadows and really talk about it more because it's a very real aspect of
It's
kids, yeah,
very
who
real.
have meltdowns. And
Yeah,
it can be kind of scary, really dealing,
very
yeah, because
scary.
it doesn't because it's not your kid, to your point, right? Like they're not
Yeah.
really in there in that moment. So,
No, they're stressed. They're in fight or
right.
flight, and it is extremely hard though as a parent to remain calm, right? Especially because maybe your nervous system is not calm and relaxed. You could think of you like, okay, yeah, 20 years before having a kid, I was so chill and stuff like that. If something like this happened, I'd be able to handle it. But if your child is 15 and you've been dealing with this for, I don't know, 10 years or 5 years, right? This constant pressure on your nervous system, you're going to react in a much different way. But yet, that little voice that we all have will tell us, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that. You're a terrible parent. You need to remain calm." All this stuff, and it's like, oh my
Mhm.
goodness, I have to deal with this meltdown, and then I have to deal with the criticism internally from my own
Right.
head as to how I didn't do a good job. And then if you do talk about it to some people, people who don't understand autism might think that you're not a good parent, or that might be the parent's fear. Like, if anyone ever finds out that this is what happens, then they're going to think I'm a terrible parent and I caused this all myself.
Right.
And that's not the case. And literally many of the times meltdowns are related to some health
Yeah.
aspect. So it's really important for health to be front and center.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message, right? Because yeah, these things can be so misunderstood. So,
Oh,
yeah,
completely.
I
Yeah.
mean, so as we bring our conversation to an end, I always kind of like to ask all my guests the same question. And for you, it's going to be a little different, but similar. So, if there's one message that you want, like let's say a new parent to this journey, right, who's just learned that they have an autistic daughter to walk away with, one message that could really be helpful to them, what would that be?
I think one message would be, you're doing a great job and you're going to be doing something very different than many of your other friends. And just letting that set in, because a lot of times we have these expectations as to what parenting should be. And when it doesn't go that way, then we can get really frustrated and stuck. And so just acknowledging, okay, this is going to be different, but that doesn't mean that it has to be bad, right? Different can be good. How can we make this even better? So I think it's really important to understand autism is tough, especially in the beginning, but life can be even just more magical than you ever imagined if you just keep at it and stay consistent and listen to your gut as to what your child needs.
I love that advice. Yeah. And I think that is so true. Just giving yourself like the space and grace to kind of be curious about it.
Yes.
Because I mean, once you actually learn like the positive side of autism and you actually really, see what a magical kid you have, it's actually a really cool experience. So yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you so much for being here today. I know that this information is going to really make a difference for the people listening. So I really appreciate you sharing it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to the Exceptional Girls podcast. If you liked today's episode, It would mean the world to me if you'd subscribe, leave a rating and review, and recommend it to just one other person who you think would benefit from listening. Even a small act of support helps the podcast reach more people, which in turn helps increase awareness and understanding of exceptionality in girls. And if you have suggestions for future episodes, please share them. You can connect with me, your host, Julie Withrow, through our website at exceptionalgirlspodcast.com/contact.